Okay, so let's get started. We have, what we did yesterday is we got to a point where we created a NURBS curve that we then offset vertically, and I think we set it to a height of up to 1,000 feet. And then we created a rotator for the curve at the top, and now we can rotate our tower and kind of twist it like it's rubber. So we're going to kind of do parts of this on the fly, right? So, I want to walk you through the process of thinking through a couple of things. I've got part of it formulaic, but then the other part, we're going to just kind of throw a few things out there and see if we can accomplish it, right? So the objective here is flexibility. So we're going to talk through what information do we have, what do we want to accomplish, and then we're going to start piecing it together sort of as a team toward the end for certain things. The first thing that we want to do, and I'm going to start the sort of prescribed method here, is, when you have a tower, especially a tower that's 1,000 feet tall, each of those floors are going to be anywhere from 12 to 14 feet apart from one another, and that's a lot of floors to go through and split and trim and intersect or do whatever method you would use in Rhino to do it. It's a lot of floors, and especially if you plan on changing your geometry later. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at how do you create your floor plates automatically. Okay, so that's going to be step one for us. And it's actually remarkably simple. For us, what I'm going to do here, and there's a couple of different ways to actually generate a surface. I could go down here and create a 4-point surface around the base of my tower and reference it in and then offset it and do all this other jazz and do it very similar to the way that you would do it in Rhino, right, from that point on. But because I don't know precisely what the boundary of my tower is going to be at the end of the day, I want it to be parametric. So I'm going to start off by creating a grid that sits at the bottom. So I'll do a square grid. That's under vector grid. And I'm going to place it at the centroid of our original curve down at the bottom. So I need to get the centroid by going to surface analysis and plug the C in. And that gives us our centroid, which I'm going to place into the grid base plane. And for simplicity's sake, I want to actually be able to move this out from the center, and that's not super easy. You can't just say scale all directions in this program because it has a base plane. So for me, I'm just going to start with a static number of 1, and you'll see why. So when I go to set integer to 1, I went to params and I dropped it in from the primitive panel. So if you see a tiny little one like this, that's going to be usually these tiny little ones. They all come from params, either geometry or primitive. And I'm actually going to plug that into the S, the X, and the Y. Because the size here doesn't matter. This is just going to become a surface that I offset.
I got an error on that grid.
You might not have the right. Well, where'd you plug your base plane in? All right. Let me get the surface done, and I'll come back to help you out.
It's surface analysis, but vector analysis.
Oh, did I do that? Sorry. It is surface analysis. Thank you. Okay. So after we have that, the method that I did is I actually scaled the geometry from its own centroid. Okay, so it's a little bit of a roundabout method, but it makes it really simple in the end. So when I plug the curve into the geometry, and then I go to transform affine, and I click on scale. I can plug the curve or the cell, the one cell, into the G. Oh, that doesn't seem right. Maybe it is. And then I plug the centroid of that one cell into the center point of the scale. And then I can tell it how much I want it to scale. So I'm going to say 0 to 200-ish, or I'll just make a slider for 200 and plug it into F. So what's going to happen now is that is going to scale from its own center point. And that's good, but let me just show you real quick why I did that instead of the other method, which would just be, without using the center point, I could actually just use the base point. So if I scale it from the base point, instead of going out in all directions, it only scales from the point in the x and y direction, positive x and y. Make sense? So you'll understand why we're doing this in a second. So our objective here is to create floor plates, right? We want a set of floor plates that we're just going to array. So to get the actual surface you need, we go under surface and under freeform, and this is probably one of your most versatile methods of making a surface because it's so simple. When you drop in boundary surface, it has one input. It asks you for edges. And it creates surfaces off of those edges, just like this. Oops. All right. So I'm going to pause and just take a quick sweep around and make sure you're all caught up to this before I go any further. Questions? So it's time to introduce another it's a very straightforward relationship to how this operates versus Grasshopper, or I'm sorry, how Grasshopper operates versus Rhino, and that's the array, right? So we're going to do what's called a linear array on our floor plates. And that is pretty simple. It just looks like, I don't know exactly where it is. It's probably under transform. Yeah. Under transform array, we go to linear array and take a look at the inputs. So it's going to ask for the geometry that you want to array. It'll ask for the direction of the array, and it'll ask for the number. Right? So a lot of this stuff, you kind of realize a format, right? These things that you're going to do with transform, they're usually going to have a vector, some order of magnitude, and in some cases, if it's multiple, it'll ask you for the number. That's primarily it. So when we plug the surface in, you see it's starting to do something, but it's just arraying along the x and y axis. So we want to redirect the array to go vertical, and that is in what axis?
Z.
Yeah, z-axis. All right. So we plug in a unit z, and then we tell it how tall we want it to be. So if we're making floor plates, then you probably want to go anywhere from, I'll just say 0 to 15. So here's what we wound up with. You can also make a slider for the count. So if I want anywhere from 0 to 20 floors, plug that into the N input, and now I can change how many floors are being arrayed.
So the first one is how high it is, and then the second one's how many floors?
The spacing and how many.
Okay, 24.
All right. So mine is really big. Your proportions might not be exactly the same. Just realize that the base, if I turn this off, the base of my tower is like 250 feet. So if you've got one that's only 20 feet, the numbers will be kind of different for you. So I suggest that you just increase the spacing of your points at the base to make it a little bit more realistic, right? Because we're doing a high-rise tower. You should probably be like a minimum of 100 feet, maximum of, say, 300 feet. All right, so we only want the difference or the intersection of these two surfaces. The trouble is the tower that we made is not solid, so you can't really use intersect because they're planar. So there's a nifty function under surface, and give me a sec to remember where it is. I might just have to type it in.
That's okay.
Under intersect shape. I forget where it is. Hold on a sec. Here we go. There it is. There we go. So under, let me show you where this is too. Linear array is under transform array. And under intersect, we can go into the physical panel. And this one is BREP BREP. So the description says that it solves the intersection events for 2 BREPs. That's significant because a BREP doesn't have to have volume. So what we're going to do here, we have our loft, and we have our floors. And when we plug in the loft to one input, and the floors to the other input, what we get, after I turn these off, is the curves for each of the floors. So the microphone was facing the opposite direction from me, so if that video is really quiet, I apologize.
That's unfortunate.
Okay. How are we doing on time here? 13. Okay. So at this point, I'm going to stop the video, and then we'll move on to how do you actually create floors, and then what's the relationship of the floors to the actual building itself.